We are back into going through the Gospels. We are on the 42nd installment, and we're going to talk today about Crumbs of Faith. Let's do a quick recap because it's been, 6 weeks since we were in the life of Jesus? When we last left Jesus, he was talking with the Pharisees about how much they were committed to external purity and cleanliness, and they were forgetting that what's impure comes from the heart, it's the inside that matters. And Jesus landed pretty hard on this. They weren't clear in their heads about what it meant to really, truly be clean, to be holy, to be pure. And part of what Jesus is doing is kind of prepping for his ministry to the Gentiles. So far, Jesus has been focusing on the Jewish people. He has come to present himself as the Messiah. At this point, the Gospels take a shift, and you start to see Jesus go into more Gentile areas. And because Jewish people often associated uncleanness with being around the Gentiles, Jesus gave a real clear teaching to his disciples and others about what's clean and what's unclean, what counts. And what doesn't count is Gentile territory. So you're going to see him in a very clear act of ministry in a Gentile area of the region this morning. And here's the heart of today's passage. I want to give you a snippet because it's kind of the controversial snippet, and then we'll broaden it out and look at a bigger context. She, this is a Gentile, came and bowed down before him and said, "Lord, help me." And Jesus replied, "Let the children be satisfied first. For it's not right to take the children's bread," that would be the Israelites, "and throw it to the little household dogs," that would be the Gentiles. "Yes, that is true, Lord," she replied. "But even the little dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs that they make fall from the master's table." So, did Jesus just call a Gentile woman a dog? Yes. Does that feel uncomfortable? Yes. Okay, so let's chat. First, we're going to talk about dogs. We generally love dogs in our culture. How many dog people in here today? How many cat people? And look at that, we're all in fellowship together. We call them, our best friend. And I know as a kid, when I was 6 years old, I have this vivid memory. We had this, I think it was a border collie in Alabama. And I was out playing in the front yard one day, and a rabid rat started to chase me. It actually started climbing up my jeans. And our dog came over and ripped that rat off and killed it. And then died of rabies a couple days later. But the happy ending is that I made it. All right, okay, thank you. And I don't know if it's just that, but I have really loved dogs throughout my life. When Jesus was alive, people didn't generally view dogs in the same way that we do today. Now, the Greeks and the Romans, enough records survive to show that they really liked them. They had them as household pets, and probably still not the same as today, but maybe close. There's actually a tombstone inscription that has survived from the Greeks, and it reads like this: "My eyes were wet with tears, our little dog, when I bore thee to the grave. In a resting place of marble I have put thee for all time. Sagacious thou wert." I think that just means smart. "Like a human being. What a loved companion we have lost." All right, so the Greeks and the Romans, they liked their dogs. But in the Jewish world, dogs were domesticated, but they generally were seen as unclean, rebellious, a little savage. And while I'm sure it was the case that individual Jewish people cared about their dogs, kind of corporately, dogs represented something that the Jewish people didn't care for. I'll give you a couple Bible verses. 1 Samuel 16:43, Goliath said to David, "Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks?" And David said, "You're worse than a dog." 2 Kings 8:13, Hazael said, "How could your servant, a mere dog, do this monstrous thing?" In Psalms, David says, "Dogs have surrounded me," and then he compares them to a gang of evildoers that have closed in on me. In Matthew, Jesus said, and we read this a while ago, "Don't give what's holy to the dogs, or toss your pearls before pigs," kind of putting them in the same category. And then a final note on this, because this will be relevant to our text today. If you read in the tradition that the rabbis wrote, they explained, as sacred food was intended for men, but not for the dogs, the Torah was intended to be given to the chosen people, but not to the Gentiles. So the Jewish community sees dogs as a symbol for something unclean, maybe even kind of the animal side of people. But they lived kind of in a bubble of a broader context of cultures that actually really enjoyed dogs. And while it's going to be clear as we go on, comparing someone to a dog is not a compliment. It's going to land very differently in what Jesus' disciples heard him say and what the Gentile woman heard him say, and we'll get to more on that in just a little bit. So now let's talk about where she came from. The text is going to tell us this was in an area where Tyre and Sidon was, and this was populated by Canaanites. And I don't know if you're familiar with the history of the tension between the Jewish people and the Canaanites. They're distant cousins, but they don't like each other. In fact, the Canaanites were the ones that the Jewish people drove out of the promised land. And at that time, Canaanites were doing idol worship where they were sacrificing children. Like, it was bad. And the Jewish people moved in and took over. So now, the Canaanites have moved into this area. They've been assimilated into Roman culture, but that tension is still really, really there. To make it worse, this particular area appears to have kind of economically flourished on the backs of those who lived in Galilee, and you see this mentioned other places of Scripture. So basically, Tyre is taking away food and resources from an area that desperately needs it, and so it's impacting those people in a very practical sense. To connect this with the opening thing about dogs, it appears that the people in that area had a saying where the children eat at the table first, and that would be the Canaanites in Roman-occupied territory, and the scraps went to the dogs, which was the Jewish people. I don't know quite what to compare this to in a modern sense. Maybe the tension in Israel and Lebanon, which goes back to a land tension for generations and generations. If you're interested in Appalachian folklore, it's the Hatfields and the McCoys. But it's these distantly related people who just don't like each other. And the disciples would not have thought of them any more kindly than they thought of the Samaritans. And if you're familiar, as the story unfolds, at one point the disciples are going to ask if they can call fire down on a town in Samaria because they really don't like them. So this is where they're going. And so disciples are probably already struggling. This is Gentile territory they're going to go into. To them, that's ceremonially impure, which Jesus had just talked to the Pharisees about, but I'd have to think they're still processing this. And they're going into the land of the enemy. The Jewish historian Josephus clearly says these were a hated enemy of the Jews. And this is where you're going to see the testing and the highlighting of a woman's faith. So it occurs in that context. So here's the broader section. And this is from Mark 7, 24 to 30, and Matthew 15, 21 to 28. After Jesus left there, that is, talking with the Pharisees, he went to the region of Tyre and Sidon, a Gentile region with some of Israel's most bitter enemies. When he went into a house, he did not want anyone to know, but he was not able to escape notice. Instead, a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him and came and fell at his feet. This woman was a Greek Canaanite of Syro-Phoenician origin. As she cried out, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is horribly demon-possessed." But Jesus did not answer her a word. And then the disciples came and begged him, "Send her away, because she keeps on crying after us." So Jesus answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." In other words, I have come to feed my children. But she came and bowed down before him and said, "Lord, help me." And I note here, he responded with a saying she recognized. "Let the children be satisfied first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the little household dogs." "Yes, that's true, Lord," she replied. "But even the little dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs that they make fall from their master's table." And then Jesus answered her, "Dear woman," I'll just note, when he changed water to wine and his mom kind of challenged him, it's the same phrase he uses there. It's not a, like, your text might just say woman. It's not some generic kind of dismissive word. It's a word that carries deep affection. "Dear woman, your faith is great. Because you said this, you may go and let what you want be done for you. The demon has left your daughter." And her daughter was healed from that hour. She went home and found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. I had 5 points to make today. I condensed them into 3 long ones. So here's the first one. This story in context applauds Jesus as just and the woman as virtuous, which might be a different way of thinking about this passage, but I will explain. First thing to note is every other record in Scripture of someone approaching Jesus and asking for healing, Jesus is never rude or dismissive. if that's what he was doing with the woman in this case, that would stand out as unique. I think the weight of the others suggests something else was going on here. So here's a quote that's a little nerdy, I'm not going to lie, but for literature geeks like me, and because the Bible is literature, it's important to understand what's happening here. This story fits a type common in ancient literature, wherein a subject approaches their leader with a request, which is initially dismissed, but later conceded to. In the exchange, the leader is shown to be just and fair, and the subject is judged virtuous. Both receive public honor, a win-win situation which was uncommon in the zero-sum game of honor and shame that structured the ancient world's social customs. This encounter fits a pattern whereby a ruler who had every social right to ignore a plea was nevertheless shown to be compassionate by acceding to his subjects' wishes. And this is where I need to talk about context. It is very important for us to try to enter into what the original audience would have seen and heard when they saw this story unfold or when they read it. If you're like me in the 21st century living in the United States, I read that story and I kind of cringe and go, yikes. What is happening here, Jesus? This doesn't seem to fit you. Were you tired, a little snappy that day? But actually, in the context, as I understand it, this was kind of a time-honored way in which, as this unfolds, you see the worth of the woman highlighted and you see the goodness of Jesus revealed. So basically, a common saying is refurbished to show that though she's not one of the children of Israel, as she's not part of the fellowship around the table, her request is rewarded and her character is applauded. And I have to think, no doubt, much to the surprise of the disciples who wanted to call down fire on people like them. One final comment on that. The dialogue presented the woman a chance to gain honor, probably specifically in the eyes of the disciples. She pursued the virtuous course, and with the occasion to speak and model uprightness publicly, she earned the highest praise in antiquity, honor, as she secured Jesus' highest praise, woman, you have great faith, which I think is something he had yet to say to his disciples. So, as we talk about the rest, just think of the context of that story. Second point, this reveals a God whose compassion is scandalous. So he had just called out the Pharisees about making these sharp lines of distinction between people about who was holy or unclean or bad, and they were doing it by externals. Jesus is challenging that hard. And so now he's going into this Gentile territory, and somebody shows up that's going to probably put his disciples to the test. Like, they heard what Jesus just said. Now they're going to watch Jesus model what it looks like to stop viewing other people as unclean just because their external situations are different. So he goes to a Gentile place. This is ceremonially unclean. Like, typically when Jewish people would get back on Jewish land, they would wash their feet so they didn't even bring the dust back from these other lands. It's Canaanites. They're idolatrous. There's a terrible history of violence and anger between them. They are definitely spiritually unclean. It's a place full of people who had probably harmed the children of Galilee because they were so exploitive of Galilee's resources, so they're economically oppressive. A woman approaches him in a culture where women were not supposed to do that, so this is culturally offensive or at least unexpected. Odds are good that she had tried to go to the gods of her people already to help her figure this out, which would be idolatry. And it didn't work, so Scripture doesn't say this, but based on the context, Jesus probably wasn't her first option. She had probably run out of options and was desperate. And Jesus tells her that her faith is great. Her faith is great. Like I said, in contrast to his disciples, who he had to keep saying, "O ye of little faith." And it just reminds me that Jesus came to earth to offer himself and his kingdom to all people groups, all statuses, all ethnicities, all levels of rich and poor, educated or uneducated, or sick or healthy or happy or depressed, or part of the in crowd or part of the outcast. He came for everybody. And he takes his disciples after his teaching to the Pharisees immediately into this situation where he's going to model for them how nobody is off limits and untouchable. to Jesus, and thus the followers of Jesus. In fact, he had already sent out the 12. We read about this. He had already started sending them out, but he sent the 12 out to just Jewish territory. I don't know if you remember this discussion. I don't think they were ready to go to the Gentiles because they were still interested in calling down fire. But he's about to send out the 70, and they're going to go into Gentile territory. And then before he leaves, he's going to commission his disciples with the Great Commission, go into the whole world and preach the gospel. And I would think that part of their training is to watch how Jesus interacts with people who they see not only as unlikable, but as the enemy. Like, these people will hurt me, they're out to destroy me. If they're worshiping other gods, then they're idolatrous, probably all demon-possessed for all we know. Like, all the things you could think of, Jesus immediately moves them into this place as part of their training, and they watch him respond compassionately. And so if Samaritans and Canaanites have access to Jesus, there are no untouchables. There's no one so unclean that God's grace and truth can't impact their lives. Now later in Matthew's gospel, we're going to hear a parable about this wedding feast, and the people who are invited don't show up, so they send invitations out to a lot of sketchy people in the community. And it's just another story. Jesus welcoming people who are outsiders, people who are seen as the worst, the least among us, and he welcomes them. And we've already seen it. He welcomes the tax collectors. He welcomes the prostitutes. He welcomes the people the Jewish community saw as absolutely unclean. Jesus welcomes them. So the answer is, who could come to Jesus? Is anyone can come to Jesus. I think it's a good reminder that the light of the gospel shines into the darkest of places, even places we think might be impenetrable or we're tempted to give up on. I hear discussion today. I feel like our culture is increasingly getting divided and beginning to view the other side the way the Jewish people viewed the Canaanites, as unclean, untouchable, probably all demon-possessed. Like, this is such a thick, dark evil that the best I can do is get away from it, and best case scenario, they're destroyed. That is not what Jesus models. That's a mission field, not a place for destruction. Yeah, there's no way the disciples went there expecting to find someone who would kneel at the feet of Jesus and call him the Son of David. No way they expected that. You would have expected that from the Pharisees, who did not, but not from this place. The light of Christ shines into the surprisingly dark places. And that's why we never write off people or a place. It's why we go into all the world and preach the gospel. If you would be so kind as to indulge me in this right now, think of a place that you just think, that is just populated by evil. And the people there are the worst. Can I challenge you to pray for that this week? Pray for them. Pray for the light of the gospel, because there is no place so dark that the light of the gospel can't shine in. You might be shocked, the people in those places who are ready to fall at the feet of Jesus, if they would just see the good news presented in front of them. In fact, I think we might be shocked at how hardened those with access to Jesus have become. In comparison, how ready are those who seem to us to be far from him. And then my third point. Even the crumbs of the gospel are amazing and good. This is from the Jamieson Fausset Brown Bible commentary. And they're kind of reparaphrasing what the woman said. Not of the children? True. But one crumb of power and grace from thy table shall cast the devil out of my daughter. And I had never thought of it like that before. That freeing someone from demonic oppression or possession is a crumb in the feast of the kingdom. Like, to me, if you try to think of something where you would most demonstrate the power and goodness of God at work in the world, like he already did this with the demoniac. I don't know if you remember this from a couple months ago. In fact, we're going to revisit that land next Sunday. This demoniac that nobody could control and chains couldn't hold him, and he was a crazy man, and Jesus frees him. And to me, that's feels like the ultimate story of freeing someone from something like that kind of evil. And here, this woman in this parable says, I'll just take a crumb from the feast. And Jesus says, you got it. And her daughter is freed from demonic possession. That's remarkable. Number one, not only to help us see the richness of the kingdom of God, but to remind us that even the smallest portions of that have profound life-changing impact on people. And I think we see crumbs of all kinds throughout the course of the world and even in the Gospels. And I want to be careful with this analogy because it sounds like crumb is dismissive, and I don't mean it that way, because my point is that even the crumbs are amazing. You're going to see this story is situated between the feeding of the 5,000, remember this? And then shortly after this is the feeding of the 4,000. It appears the first one was to Jewish people, and the second one is to Gentile people. And in both of those, they're functionally the same to a different group of people. Jesus miraculously multiplies the resources that are there and then has tons left over. And most commentators seem to think this story is situated between these two for a reason. Like, even when the children are fed first. The idea that the children couldn't be fed because you were giving something to someone else is ridiculous. There's so much left over to offer to others. And this woman appeals to Jesus' generosity. And she says, I'm not one of your children, but I know what's on the table is good, and I know there's more than enough for everybody. The Africa Bible Commentary says it this way: by faith, she saw herself as a Gentile benefiting from the blessings of Israel. Okay, I just got to give you my sense here because commentators differ on some things that are happening here. I think that she arrived and left what the Bible calls a God-fearer, which is what Cornelius is called elsewhere. That is, she recognizes the power of God. She recognizes perhaps that the idols she's worshiping are not the true God. And when she hears about Jesus, she recognizes there's something important about Jesus. But the Bible does not record that she becomes a follower of Jesus. Jesus rewards her faith by healing her daughter. And so I don't think this is a conversion story, actually. I think it's a provision story. And I could be wrong about that. I'm not going to die on this hill. Just for a number of reasons. I think this story is showing us that this doesn't stop Jesus from providing for her need from the kingdom storehouse. In other words, Jesus blesses the whole world in some ways. Even when you're not a child of God, Jesus in his grace and mercy extends things from the storehouse of the kingdom for others. I'll give you a story from the Talmud that kind of captures this, and I wonder if Jesus isn't taking this analogy and applying it to the world. There was a famine in the land, and the stores of corn were placed under the care of Rabbi Jehuda the Holy, to be distributed to those only who were skilled in the knowledge of the law. Note, distributed only to those skilled in the knowledge of the law. And behold, a man clamorously asked for his portion. The rabbi asked him whether he knew the condition and had fulfilled it. And then the supplicant changed his tone, and he said, no, but feed me as a dog is fed, who eats of the crumbs of the feast. And the rabbi hearkened to his words and gave him of the corn. That's a pretty tight overlap between that story from the Talmud and what we just read. I suspect Jesus is taking imagery that was known in the Jewish community and applying it now to the Gentiles. That there are crumbs that everybody partakes in. So I'm going to see if I could summarize the fullness of the gospel in 4 points. I can't. This is going to be a bird's eye view, because I think we could sometimes think the gospel is just one particular thing, but the reality is that the scope of the gospel is everything. So here we go, 4 points. First, Jesus came to earth to save, deliver, and heal. First, in our hearts and souls, the hearts and souls of humanity, the image bearers of God. But second, in the entirety of creation, as it groans and it awaits redemption. His life, his death, his resurrection, they confirm that the king has arrived to establish his kingdom in the midst of all the fallen empires. In fact, Jesus over and over says, the kingdom of heaven is hand, the kingdom of heaven is here. He announces the kingdom. The church then establishes kind of outposts of his kingdom, and I don't know if it's oases or oases, whatever the plural of an oasis is. It's The outpost of the kingdom recognizes there's a spiritual war going on, and so we're establishing places everywhere we go to fight against the forces of spiritual darkness, what the Bible calls wickedness in high places. And this is Oasis's idea is that as we live in the desert of the world, we're also situating ourselves in communities where those who are dying of thirst get a drink of water. So I want to read this paragraph because I tried to word it very purposefully. We're fighting spiritual principalities and powers. We're taking cups of water and living water to the spiritually and physically thirsty. Bread and the bread of life to the spiritually and physically hungry. Clothes and clothes of righteousness to the physically and spiritually naked. Practical provision to the economically poor and the riches of Christ to the spiritually bankrupt. Doctors and the great physician to the physically and spiritually sick. We're declaring freedom to those in spiritual bondage and working for freedom for the physically oppressed. That when the people of God are to move into a community, the blessings of God ought to be spreading out all around us. They're not just meant for us. They're meant to impact everyone around us. And then there's Jesus, the bread of life, the fountain of living water, who offers the nourishment of life everlasting, with even the crumbs and the sips of his grace pointing toward the love of Jesus. So note, the gospel begins, John 3:16. God so loved the world, he gave his son. Whoever believes in him will not perish but has everlasting life. But the good news doesn't end there, because God is at work through Jesus, mending all that is broken. And when these broken things are mended, they're signposts that point to Jesus. Because the good news of the gospel touches every part of our life. And it touches every part of our society. Nothing is outside of the scope. When it changes our heart, it will guide our hands. And so, you remember Jesus talking about when you do something for the least of these, you've done it for me? And Jesus is talking about really practical things. You visited them in prison. You clothed them. You fed them. You gave them water. Like all these types of things. The least of these around us should be rejoicing when Jesus brings us sinners into his family, because that means their lives are about to get better too. And it might just be the crumbs, but what do crumbs leave a trail to? The feast. What were those old signs? Were they Burma shave signs they used to put along the highways? Like sign. Some of you, how old do you have to be to know about Burma shave signs? I don't know. But you drive down the road, and instead of one billboard with a sign, it was like 10 things in a row that you would read. I think the crumbs of the gospel are almost like those old Burma shave signs. They're leading you in a particular direction. And it's going to lead you to the feast, and it's going to lead you to the one who is offering the feast. It reminds me of when Jesus healed the demon-possessed man. He just said, go and tell people what I've done. He was going to tell them how he was healed, right? That was going to point them toward Jesus. You're going to see next week that when Jesus goes back into that territory, crowds of people follow him. That seems to have been the work of one person, just telling him about a crumb that he got. And the word spread, and they show up to follow Jesus. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. So where will this lead people? To the feast. John 6:33. The bread of God is that which comes down out of heaven and gives life to the world. That's Jesus. Jesus declared, John 6:35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. John 6, once again, this is Jesus. I am the living bread that came down out of heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever, and the bread which I give for the life of the world is my flesh, that is his crucifixion. He dies so we can live. As I've been thinking about this section this week, well, I had a lot more thoughts banging around in my head that could fit into a sermon. If you're coming to Message Plus, we can hash them out because you've probably got some thoughts banging around too. Two things stand out to me. The love of Jesus for everyone. Once again, the light of the gospel is meant to shine in the darkest of places. We are never meant to write people or places off. Jesus came that all could have life and life abundant. So part of our mission is to never give up. Never give up on people. even if it's just praying, even if there's times we have to remove ourselves from situations for whatever important reasons, we can still pray that the light of the gospel shines into the darkest of places. And the second thing that strikes me is how I underestimate the goodness of the kingdom. If being healed of demonic oppression is just a crumb, oh, the riches of the kingdom are deep and inexhaustible. And I think I might be enamored with a lot of the crumbs, which is what I need to just constantly have them turning me back toward the goodness of the feast and the one who made it. So that's my prayer this morning, Lord. May we be drawn to the feast of Christ, the depth and the riches and the spiritual and emotional and mental nourishment that Jesus provides to us. Thank you for his love, his radical, scandalous love for all. May we see that, and may it change our lives as we recognize your love for us. But Lord, may the love that you have shown to us through Christ flow out into the world around us, to our friends, our family, our coworkers, our neighbors. May we have your heart for even the darkest of places. And Lord, wherever we go, may we just scatter crumbs relentlessly. And may they be good. And may they lead people to the riches of you. Amen.